the International Institute for Global Security Studies has created the INISEG CAST section with the purpose of informing, analyzing, conversing, and discussing in a natural and uncensored way each and every one of the political and social events that happen in society. We are not journalists, but we still believe that we have the power to speak up and educate our audience. Why not deliver a different point of view? No violence, no bad words, no bad intentions. Just be us. We are INISEG CAST, connecting thoughts. Welcome to this section of INISEG CAST, where we can have a pleasant and relaxed conversation about current affairs at the international level. We are INISEG, the International Institute for Global Security Study, and today, as a special day, being our first episode, we have a very special guest with us. Yeon Yu is a Korean-American attorney and former government official. Is professor in the Emanuel Heller Professor of Law and director of the Korea Law Center, the California Constitution Center, and the Law School's program in Public Law and Policy. His most recent book is Defender-in-Chief, Donald Trump Fight for Presidential Power in 2020, and is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute. He studied in Harvard University and Yale University. He will be our first guest in this section. And with us also we have Professor John Lemos. He is a lecturer, researcher, and analyst for INISEG in the International Center for Advanced Research, and our master degree, Political Leadership and International Relations. It's professor at the University of Lisbon and Bachelor and Master of Law from the Faculty of Law of the University of Lisbon. Also, is member of research centers, private law research center, member of the editorial boards of scientific journals. So welcome to you two, and thank you for being here in our first episode. It's an honor for us to have you. Of course, John is our first guest, and you all will be with us in every episode from now on. That you were not particularly enthusiastic about then candidate Trump early. So why did you decide to write a book defending President Trump's role as a defender of the Constitution?
In the beginning, because he's a populist, and populists often campaign against the status quo and the existing pattern for organizing the government and political practice. And so I thought President Trump might actually strain against or even try to violate the Constitution in various ways, because populists want to achieve their mandate from the people rather than respect established traditions. But on the other hand, after 4 years, I have found that actually President Trump, who has been remarkably disrupted our political system and has really changed the way presidents act and their relationship with the citizens and other institutions of government, I think that made his opponents so crazy in various ways that now actually I think his opponents are the ones who are proposing large constitutional changes in the organization of the American government and the way the political system works.
Really appreciate it. Having such a sharp legal mind, one of the most brilliant scholars, constitutional scholars nowadays, Professor John Yu. It's a great honor to be here with you. And you misspell, and out of a mistake, you describe President Trump as a Professor Trump. Don't you think that, for example, considering the last debate, President Trump was really a professor? Don't you think that President Trump taught Joe Biden how the Constitution works? Especially, you say that there is a populist tension, and the populists don't kind of like the constitutional devices and the institutional organization. But when Joe Biden, for example, say that the Obamacare is in the ballot for the justice, the Supreme Court appointee, don't you think that President Trump explained to Joe Biden how the Constitution works?
You could see how much now President Trump relies on the Constitution in making his case to be president. He argued about his right to appoint a justice to the Supreme Court. That right is given under the Constitution. He mentioned that he's trying to appoint justices who believe in interpreting the Constitution based in its original meaning, rather than giving judges the power to constantly import modern social norms into the law. He, as you said, he pointed out that Obamacare was a sweeping nationalist effort to nationalize our healthcare industry. It was too broad. He mentioned the possibility that the Democrats would what we call pack the Supreme Court, which would be to add 6 new justices to the existing 9 until the Supreme Court started to rule the way it wanted to. He discussed getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate, which would allow new states to be added and allow the large passage of large nationalizing legislation, the Green New Deal. So it's true. I think you're quite right, Professor, that the debate, chaotic as it was, it really showed the difference of Trump when he campaigned 4 years ago, and then how he's actually governed the last 4 years, which is his critics are the ones now saying, let's pack the Supreme Court. Let's get rid of the Electoral College. Let's have broad new federal powers. And Trump is one actually who's relying on the Constitution to try to limit that kind of revolutionary change. And I think he's trying to restore something that looks more like the 18th century Constitution, where elected politicians are the ones who are in charge of important public policy, not independent and somewhat unaccountable bureaucracies.
Wouldn't you consider, I mean, I read your book, and it's very interesting because I think you made a case for President Trump, and how you switch from Trump, let's say opponent in the sweet way, and to President Trump supporter, or at least voter. And but it is interesting because you don't kind of adopt a certain legal doctrine. You say that it's a new way of, there's a so-called originalist approach to the Constitution, which is usually connected with the conservatives. People think that conservatives means to be originalist, but you give us a new approach to the Constitution. It's not a strictly dogmatic originalist approach, I would say, but you put the burden, your constitutional test is in the resilience of the institutions, I would say, and most importantly, I would say, in the coordination between governmental branches. So basically, you think, I'm now, it's an interpretation that it's the constitutional process is a fight between, it's like a debate, Joe Biden Trump debate back and forth between equal branches of government. And basically, in the book, you told the executive power is has been the most affected, diminished, at least most controversial, and is the one that is seeing has been seeing is its powers diminish. And it's interesting because there's a lot of people who say that United States is nowadays a very divided country, right? And that divisiveness was reflected in the debate, in last debate. So, but last debate, we can anticipate that this kind of debate, heated debate, is not a unique case in democracy. It's not an exception in democracy. Democracy nowadays, and in the last years, I would say decades, we've seen that it's about conflict, right? It's about conflict between branches of government. And I think that the debate enshrines two different visions of the Constitution, of the society, but it's the new paradigm of democracy, I would say.
I quite agree, and I think there's a lot of similarities, more than either one would like to admit, between the Obama and Trump administrations in this way. First, President Obama's probably greatest legislative achievement was Obamacare, national health care. That's passed with no Republican votes in Congress. It was a very partisan exercise. And then, as you say, once, and this is a good example of how the Constitution reacts, then large majorities are eventually elected to the House and the Senate and its state and local governments who opposed President Obama's health care plan. And so that leaves President Obama then having to govern through executive orders, through creative interpretation of the laws, through his own constitutional powers. But for the most part, President Obama's domestic agenda finds very difficult acceptance after that. President Trump has also governed in a period where for several years he had majorities in Congress as well, and he was able to pass his tax cuts. But after he lost the majority in Congress, he also has now been relying a lot more on these same executive orders, creative interpretation of laws, relying on his constitutional powers. But there's nothing wrong with that. So as I argue in the book, that's actually part of the constitutional design. And then every 4 years, the voters get to evaluate which side they agree with, the president or they agree with the Congress, and they can change our leadership rather quickly and decisively. And now they have very clear choices before them about, President Trump, through his executive orders, through the tax cuts, has made his vision for government very clear, versus Joe Biden, who very much represents the Obama years. He was the vice president during the Obama years, and he's really been campaigning on the idea that he's going to sort of restore another 8 years of the Obama administration.
An observation about the European example. You know that now even the so-called parliamentary systems, there's a trend which is the executive power is no longer the parliament to control the executive. Is the executive who is starting to get control over the parliament because of the political affiliations. The leader, the charismatic leader, the leader who gets that, who is the leader of the party, the prime minister, who is the leader of the ruling party. The ruling party actually works like, I would say, a president of a major parliamentary coalition, and it's not the parliamentary coalition who steps and puts its idea through the government. Is the government who control over and defines what the majority in the parliament do, which is a very interesting change in the radical political change in the way the Constitution and the political system work. But getting back to the United States, and that's why Professor John, you made a very good point. That's why I don't call Donald Trump a populist. I call Donald Trump an Americanist. I think the question is not populism or some or other political philosophy. I think the great divide, that if you want to put these in these terms, is between Americanism, President Trump Americanism, and Joe Biden, let's say globalism or global approach, socialist, progressive, globalist approach. It's very interesting because yes, imagine people charge President Trump with populist accusations, but if you see, and Professor John, you mentioned that President Trump basically is defend the American traditions, the American way of thinking, the American very specific political thought, and the Constitution, the founding reasoning of the American Constitution. But if we look into American history, the Constitution, even for the liberals, or especially for the liberals, the liberal progressive scholars and politicians, the Constitution is not exactly, was rewritten by popular movements. If let's get back to even President Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, one might say that his approach to Dred Scott, the Supreme Court Dred Scott rule, was a populist way. You say the court struck down my bill, my legislation, so I create this conflict against the Supreme Court, which ultimately led to the Civil War. The civil rights movement, and the way forced a constitutional change, even though the American Constitution basically is the same text, but the meaning for some has evolved in a way that was pretty much generated by these popular movements. So the ones that are criticizing Trump for being a populist, actually they defend legal doctrines that are strictly populist. The so-called the living constitution. The living constitution is a way of populism, constitutional populism, because it says that the constitution, the judge, the court must obey to the general social movements and the new perspectives that are in society. So it's interesting because the ones that say that the American constitutional is at risk because of Donald Trump are the ones who defend legal doctrines that don't care about, that see the Constitution as a blanket space that they can feel whenever or in the way, in what way they want.
I think a dividing line between the two parties in the United States and between conservatives and progressives is not an opposition to change. I think sometimes people think the Constitution itself in the United States is just anti-change. It's not an effort to sort of permanently fix all the laws and the government and the economy in one way, or one state. But the disagreement between conservatives and liberals in the United States, I think, in part, is about how do you properly engage in reform or change. And so I think that over the years, since the 1950s, progressives favor broad power for the judiciary and trying to constitutionalize a lot of issues because it's easier to change things that way. All you need is 5 justices of the Supreme Court, really, to agree about, say, gay marriage or abortion, and then the law in the whole country changes immediately. It's much harder to build coalitions and get legislation passed in Congress, or even to get the 50 states to pass legislation in the areas of their competence. So conservatives, on the other hand, think the the courts are supposed to have a narrow role, that the Constitution leaves most questions, I think, to the political process and to elections, and that if there is to be change, it should occur through the voters selecting their representatives and then they making their choices about legislation. And I think this is something where some American thinkers admire the European system somewhat, because I think they had used to admire a European political system for having parties that were very clearly ideological and that had presented very clear choices to voters. And then if you voted for one party versus another, that program was immediately implemented through legislation. Here in the United States, a lot of, I think, liberal scholars were very critical of American parties and our system because our parties drive to the middle. And so it has a moderating effect. The two parties for a long time were thought not to be that different. We don't have a Green Party, for example, in the United States. We don't have a Socialist Party in the United States. All the ideas sort of get absorbed by the two political parties, and then you win elections by campaigning to the middle here in the United States, rather than in Europe trying to be a very distinct ideological program. However, I think that the United States is becoming more like Europe in this regard, that the Republican and Democratic parties are now a conservative party and a liberal party. They have very clear differences in ideology. And one of those differences is their attitude to the Constitution and the courts and how rapidly the country should engage in change.
Do you think really we are watching the democracy's twilight, like the historian Anne Applebaum says a few weeks ago, precisely because this charismatic president and all these things that are happening in the United States about strong executive power? What would you respond, for example, to Anne Applebaum?
Ignores American history. So yes, we have turmoil right now in the United States. They're undeniable. But we've had much worse turmoil in our history in the past. Professor Stebbins mentioned the Civil War. I mean, we've had a civil war where 600,000 people were killed and slavery was eliminated, and much of the Constitution was fundamentally changed to protect individual liberties. The Great Depression and the New Deal was a much bigger change, much more turmoil, much bigger change in government than anything that's happening now. And of course, then the Revolutionary period, even I would say the Civil Rights era of the 1960s was much more unstable, and there was much more turmoil politically then. So I think I read things actually very differently. I think what we are is not coming to a twilight of democracy. We're just coming to an end of a certain style of governance. I think what's really happening in a bigger, if you take a step back, is that we have governments that were organized and created to regulate the economies of the 1930s to the 1960s, the economies of the Industrial Revolution, where you had like one big company that made all the steel in the country, and it would have nationwide production chains, and it would sell the same product everywhere. And everyone would go to a factory and work there on a mass production line, and then it would go out. So you had an economy of the years, from the 30s, I'd say, to the 90s, where you still had the basic forms of mass production, industrial revolution style economy. And so you have a government that's also large and administrative to regulate that. But now our economy is really changing quite rapidly. Right now we're moving to, we could not have this forum without the information revolution and the communications revolution, where a great deal of wealth does not physically exist. Right? Like what we're doing now has no physical existence, right? But it is valuable, I hope.
Yeah.
But it's a valuable exercise. People will pay for it. People want it. So much of our economy has moved to intangible, non-physical. So I think our governments and their structure and their operation have to adapt and change to this new kind of economy and society we have, but it's still stuck in the past of the 30s. So in our system, every time that happens, when you have a very strong mismatch between the way the government has been built and operates and then how society has changed, you have like a tectonic shift, like an earthquake, and the government has to undergo serious reform. And whenever that happens, you are going to have a lot of turmoil and political fighting, because there will be a lot of interest groups and established interests that will lose when this new style of government has been created. So again, this is almost like, again, Donald Trump, I think, is doing that. He may not be exactly conscious of it even, but when he's trying to pare down the size of government, have it react more quickly to the president and to the executive agenda, is making it more nimble. That's the kind of government you could see that we'll need for the future of the information revolution. You say in this area that we all work in national defense and security, the kind of threats that nations face now are not conventional armies all the time. Now they can the pandemic shows it could be biological, of course, cyber, robotic, all kinds of threats now. The government has to be smaller and faster. In a way, maybe the national security and military agencies are adapting first and quicker than the civilian agencies, because they see this threat, they see it as a threat. But when you have to reorient government so quickly and to change it so rapidly, then I think you're going to have a lot of political turmoil. I don't think it's a fault of democracy. I actually think it's a fault of permanent government, and that I think we're going to undergo more of these shocks as we go through this period until our government has adapted to this new world.
I totally agree with Professor John Yu. I totally subscribe your words 100%. And it's very interesting that these comments that Roxanne cited of Anne Applebaum is an example of this kumbaya conception of democracy, that any conflict that we have between the governmental branches is the falling of democracy.
Disaster, yeah.
Yes. When we have a conflict between a governmental branch, let's say the president and the Supreme Court, it's the end of democracy.
Yeah.
A totalitarian regime. It's quite the opposite, because in dictatorship, in totalitarian regimes, you don't have that kind of position.
That possibility,
Yeah, because the power is centralized, is absorbed in one person, one institution, whatever.
Authority, yeah.
Yeah. So I totally agree with Professor John Yu. But I want to introduce here, because it's related with Roxana's question, because we are talking about this kumbaya vision of democracy and the so-called dawning of democracy. But the proposal of packing the court is perhaps, most likely, the most outspoken way or desire to actually make this so-called assault on the Constitution. Because you are, of course, during the United States constitutional history, there has been a lot of changes in the court, but we are now facing is a proposal to pack the court because of political reasons, because there's a constitutional device. The president nominates the judge, Amy Barrett, and because Democrats don't agree with the nomination, they want to pack the court. And this is an assault on the Constitution, because this will mean, in my perspective, in the not so far term, that the weakening of the judiciary, because now if this Democrat proposal succeeds to packing the court, in every election from now on, the Supreme Court will be actually on the ballot, because the Republicans could say, well, don't worry about that, because if we don't agree with the ruling, we add more justice to the court. And when will this end, right?
Is that, as I mentioned before, the Supreme Court has kept expanding its authority over very important controversial issues, like abortion is, of course, the one that we talk about all the time in the United States. I know friends from other countries don't understand why is abortion the one issue which divides the whole country. There could be a whole lot of other ones, but the abortion issue represents different attitudes to the role of the Supreme Court in society. If you care about abortion or gay marriage, before you would participate in the political process. Now, the only way you can affect policy on these issues is to affect who's on the Supreme Court. And so it's no surprise to me, anyway, that the elements of political campaigning, you see them applied now to the Supreme Court. You see them now applied to the confirmation of justices. Yeah. You see now where many Americans know who the justices even are. I think 30, 40 years ago, justices and judges could walk around on the street. No one would have any idea who they were or what they looked like because they weren't that important. But now they are extremely important, more important than legislators in their ability to change our social policies. So I actually think that what Trump is doing, this will be his third appointment to the Supreme Court. I think all three of those Trump justices share the desire to scale back the court's involvement in society, to stop deciding these hot button issues. And actually, I think that would be a healthy thing in the long run. It will solve the problem you're asking about. It will start to recede when the Supreme Court itself becomes less important. So if the court, for example, were to return abortion to the state legislators and just say, we're not going to decide abortion cases anymore, then people who care about abortion will stop fighting over the Supreme Court. They will turn to state legislatures or to the Congress, which is where the political energies of people should be directed. I think it would take time, but I think that would be a very healthy development. And then you will see the political process fighting less about confirmations, and we won't care. We'll return to that time, I hope, where justices are not celebrities and that we don't know who they are even, because they're, the lead on all issues will be with the president and Congress and the states where it belongs, operating, of course, within the constitutional framework of individual rights and separation of powers and federalism that will still be monitored by the courts, but leaving the really important political questions to elections, which is where they belong.
With this Supreme Court and the judiciary power control over democracy, or at least supremacy, we the people has been replaced by we the lawyers, right? Which is even from a perspective of equality, is not, because in democracy, theoretical, every citizen has the right to vote, but no one, not everybody has the capacity to fight in the court for some political standing. So this can create actually a societal, social division. But I have a question that I have from reading your book. I would like, if Roxana allows me, I don't want to play Chris Wallace. Professor John, you think that the professor is debating with this Supreme Court and the judiciary power control over democracy, or at least supremacy, we the people has been replaced by we the lawyers, right? Which is even from a perspective of equality, is not, because in democracy, theoretical, every citizen has the right to vote, but no one, not everybody has the capacity to fight in the court for some political standing. So this can create actually a societal, social division. But I have a question that I have from reading your book. I would like, if Roxana allows me, I don't want to play Chris Wallace. Professor John, you think that the professor is debating to people, but it's the following. Do you admit that the president and the executive authority, the executive power, may reject Supreme Court ruling because the Supreme Court overreach its power, its constitutional power, and the president, according to the presidential interpretation of the Constitution, the ruling of the Supreme Court is unconstitutional, violating the Constitution.
This, of course, is the problem that faced Abraham Lincoln. And it doesn't come up that often, luckily, in our politics and history, but it does come up every now and then. And my view is that the president ultimately, he has to execute the judgment of a court, which is who won the case, the plaintiff or the defendant. But what he's not bound by is the opinion of the court, the reasons it gave. So, because I think that the Constitution does not set up any of the three branches as superior to the others. And so each branch, I think, has the right to interpret the Constitution for itself when it does its own, when it's performing its own functions. So if you think about Lincoln, he thought that, I think properly so, that the Constitution gave states the right to decide whether to have slavery or not, and Congress had the right to decide whether to allow slavery in the territories. The Supreme Court had a case about a slave who escaped and became free in the North and had to be returned to the original slave owner. The Supreme Court said you have to return the freed slave. If someone's a slave, they're always a slave, essentially. Lincoln thought this was wrong. I think Lincoln was correct in that. So what Lincoln said is, okay, if I have to hand over, if the court's decision is this individual slave has to be returned to the slave owner, I will carry that out for that one person. But for all the other cases, I am not going to follow the Supreme Court. It's just and this is what's called, it's an opinion. It's their opinion of what the Constitution means. As president, I am allowed to have my own opinion about what the Constitution means. And in my functions, I will carry out my understanding. So presidents have done that during very heated, controversial times, but I do think that that's their right. And of course, if the Congress disagrees with the president or think he's abusing the power, they can impeach him and remove him. And certainly the voters will have their say during the elections every 2 years. And then after 4 years, they could remove the president too if they disagree with him.
On your book is something that personally I read also your book, and regarding presidential power and foreign policy, you wrote exactly, the president can make the promises, but he can neither construct nor maintain an international order without the active participation of Congress. So basically, if you allow me to test that you are killing the executive power regarding foreign policy, not fighting for it. Do you agree about that?
Our founders thought that the power of the purse was actually the most important power, the power to spend money. And so the president can set foreign policy. I have no doubts about that. The president, the executive branch decides whether the U.S. is going to be fundamentally friendly or hostile to each country in the world. But when it comes to how you live up to that policy, that's in the hands of Congress. So, for example, the United States is a leading nation in NATO. It has bases, troops, equipment in Western Europe as a deterrent to the Soviet Union for many years, and now maybe Russia. But if the United States Congress doesn't pay for the troops and the equipment and all the resources needed to live up to NATO, then the president's promise is hollow. So I think even though the president has a constitutional authority over the policy, he needs to work with Congress to get Congress to supply the resources. And that's true of domestic affairs as well as foreign affairs. But I think it's different because in foreign affairs, the president still acts first. He still makes the commitments. He still makes the promises. But he can't live up to it by himself. He still needs Congress to support him. And generally, Congress is, it used to be said that politics ends at the water's edge. in the United States that Congresses generally do support the president and the foreign policy, do try to live up to the promises, do try to support the foreign policy set by the executive, sometimes even by the opposite party, by providing all those resources and money and equipment that we need. So NATO, of course, Republicans and Democratic presidents have held office in the many years since 1949, but Congress has consistently supported the NATO commitment with large military spending, even though they might have disagreed with that individual president. And we look at the whole, now 70-year history, the Congress and the president have worked together well, I think.
Foreign policy, we are talking about. It's interesting, and getting back to the question about the assault on the Constitution, it's interesting that there's a lot of people saying that President Trump major foreign policy decision unconstitutional, or was like let's say an expression of very violent and not so polite, but very common barbarian in the White House. But it's, for example, the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem and so on. But it's interesting that President Obama, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called Iran Deal, without the consent of the Congress, right? And the Constitution expressly set out that the president needs the consent of the Congress to ratify and to be bound by international agreements.
Right. So this is it. I think this is a good example of what happens if presidents do make promises and commitments that the Congress opposes. Right? The Congress clearly opposed. President Obama wanted to submit the agreement to Congress, but Congress actually refused to accept it. And they said they refused to. They said there's no way it was going to get ratified as a treaty. And even as asking for signs of congressional support in a statute, President Obama really couldn't get even that. And so without that, it was extremely easy for President Trump to say, well, I'm reversing it right away. If Congress had actually started passing laws, and Congress can do a lot of things. It could have changed the tariff laws and made, opened up trade with Iran. It could have lifted sanctions on Iran. It could have started reopening relations with Iran. But instead, Congress actually increased sanctions against Iran. It made things harder on Iran. I think that made it really difficult for any executive policy for President Obama to survive very long. And so once President Trump wins, one president can always repeal and undo the actions of previous presidents. And that was easy for President Trump to reverse. I think that's what I was saying. If the president and Congress cooperate, then it makes it very difficult for the policy to change quickly. So some people say President Trump is very skeptical of NATO. He would probably like to withdraw, or maybe he's just bargaining, trying to get other countries to increase their contributions. But it's not that serious a threat when everyone can see, oh, well, Congress is still pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into the defense of Europe. Right? Because you see both branches really do agree. It makes it harder for any individual president to switch policy that quickly if Congress is also in full support. So that I think this was also a sign of what happened at the end of the Obama years. He became more and more unwilling to cooperate with Congress. He became more partisan, acted by himself. But that also meant that his policies were built on sand at the end. It became very easy to undo.
Do you think that posture of the Democrats to act more unilaterally, more rejecting bipartisan agreement or bipartisan approach based on the Obama legacy, based on Obama experience, do you think that a so-called president, a possible President Biden would do that kind of thing, that I'm the president, I'm in charge, no more bipartisan, if the Republicans want to get on board, fine, If not, I'm moving on. And so the Biden, the Biden president be more like the Obama final years.
I think it's going to depend not just on the result of the presidential election in November, but the result of the congressional elections too.
Yeah.
If Joe Biden's party ends up having large majorities in the House and the Senate, then they'll be able to have sort of unified government that can carry out a set agenda. But if the voters are not, sometimes people say the American voters don't like having any one party in charge. And so they have often voted in divided government where the Congress is in other hands than the president. You could easily see that being the outcome as well, where the Senate Republican hands, even if Joe Biden were to win the presidency, that would require President Biden to engage in a fair amount of compromise if he wants to achieve anything. Or it could just mean, as you suggest, it could just be more like the end of the Obama years where a Biden administration would have to do a lot of things unilaterally, but then without the support of Congress that makes it temporary. Without Congress voting funds, voting supplies, changing the law, then any of these executive orders can be easily undone by the successive Republican presidents.
It's interesting that back then, when Obama assumed that posture, no one, as far as I remember, no one has ever pointed their finger to Obama and told President Obama that you are violating the Constitution, you are making an assault on the Constitution. But just one note, an additional note. I think also I agree with you, and I think that Iran deal proves your point in the book that you made on the book, because note that President Trump, even though the Joint Comprehensive Plan, the Iran deal, did not have the consent of the Congress, President Trump did not just this is unconstitutional. Let's get out of it. Actually, the administration has issued a lot of waivers, giving the possibility to the Iran to comply with their obligations, and if so, the administration would continue to maintain the United States binding to the agreement. But so President Trump, otherwisely what people say it, did not just flip over and get the United States out of the Iran deal. Gave the opportunity to Iran to adjust, which means that President Trump was not such a disruptor to break all the United States engagements and promoting that assault on the constitutional and on the institutional government of the United States. And but as Professor John says, and I agree, President Trump could just say this is unconstitutional. The Congress did not approve, did not give their consent, so I'm out. And President Trump did not do that, and the president could possibly done that. So it's very interesting to know that.
Take you back on time and fly when you served in the Bush administration, because it was really controversial about that you were one of the targets of the anti-American discourse, because these so-called torture memos. What do you think about the critique that you got for these memos? About your vision of the president powers and account limitation based on human rights, more or less about this topic of your memos. What do you think about the critics? How you respond to that?
This was exactly the reason that the founders created a presidency as a separate independent institution from the legislature, why the United States did not follow a parliamentary system like many Western European countries. And the reason was because it was thought there should be an independent branch that can act quickly and decisively in response to emergencies and crises. And I think the 9/11 attacks were exactly that. They were something which we had not foreseen. They were very deadly and destructive. And the president is the body in our Constitution of the United States that had to respond immediately to those circumstances. And one of the circumstances presented was, how do we fight a war against an enemy that is not a nation and does not play by any of the rules of civilized warfare, that disguises itself as civilians, deliberately attacks civilians, acts by surprise, has no territory or population. So unfortunately, the only way to really prevent terrorist attacks from an enemy that doesn't care whether it survives or an enemy that would like to die in the attack is to try to get information and intelligence. And so I think the United States, like the other democracies that have faced this problem, like Israel, like the United Kingdom, had to consider interrogation methods and detention which are different than the ones that apply to the criminal legal system. And I don't think it's surprising the United States in the end adopted very similar policies to those other democracies that have also had serious long-term terrorism problems. And I think that, and I think this is sort of also, and in the book I try to discuss what the Trump approach to foreign policy has been. It seems to me it's an emphasis on nation-state sovereignty, and that nations have the right to defend themselves and to fight for their self-preservation. And I think this was an external attack that threatened the national security of the United States. Sometimes nations have to fight those kinds of enemies, no matter how much we would rather talk about greater integration and cooperation between the civilized nations in Western Europe and the United States and East Asia. But those rules, unfortunately, there are a lot of entities and enemies in the world that don't want to live by those rules and would rather try to destroy the entire system. And so I think that's what the United States was fighting. And I think within our system, that job had to be the president's job.
And to finish completely, in one word, Professor, who was the winner in the last debate?
I think Trump won tactically, but strategically, I think he didn't win. I think he needed to change the nature of the campaign, and he wasn't able to do that. But I think he was able to win that individual debate. Yeah, he needs to do more to win the election, I think.
Yeah. Thank you to you, Professor, really for your time, for all the response about all the topics that we wanted to talk with you and we wanted to discuss with other point of view. And Joao, it's a pleasure as well. We will see you soon.
Always a pleasure. And again, I really appreciate it to discuss with one of the most brilliant legal scholars.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure for me too.
Buenos días, soy el profesor David de Cachal, director del área de Seguridad y Defensa de INISEG. En relación a este workshop del análisis de la campaña a las elecciones presidenciales de Estados Unidos, el profesor Joao Lemos Estevez, profesor del área de Ciencias Políticas y Relaciones Internacionales de INISEG, entrevistó al profesor John Yu de la Universidad de Berkeley, en la que se han analizado diversos temas enfocados a la campaña electoral en las elecciones presidenciales, en la que se han comentado los pormenores a dicha campaña, el primer round televisivo entre los dos candidatos, Trump y Biden, y los cambios en la Corte Suprema, la situación con China y la pandemia del coronavirus. Estados Unidos, podríamos decir que afronta una de las elecciones del apocalipsis. Demócratas y republicanos extreman sus advertencias sobre el rumbo del país. La presidencia de Donald Trump ha sido para la ciudadanía y sobre todo para los periodistas una verdadera escuela en cuestiones de gobierno, legislación e historia de los Estados Unidos. Mi análisis en relación a esta campaña del presidente Donald Trump a las elecciones y también de esa entrevista realizada por el workshop de INISEC, podríamos decir que el presidente ha arrancado la carrera por la reelección con desventaja en las encuestas, pero ese paso también, cuando ganó en el 2016, también tenía una cierta desventaja frente a su opositor y luego venció en las elecciones del 2016. La pregunta es, ¿Trump o Biden? ¿Quién va por delante en los sondeos para las elecciones de Estados Unidos? Acorralado por lo que llama el enemigo invisible, el coronavirus, el presidente Donald Trump ha depositado parte de sus esperanzas de ganar las elecciones en el descubrimiento de una vacuna antes del mes de noviembre. Los ensayos avanzan a un ritmo sin precedentes, pero no suficientes para Trump, que cree que una supuesta mano negra está poniendo palos en las ruedas a la industria. El Estado profundo, quien sea, dentro de la agencia del medicamento, está haciendo muy difícil que las farmacéuticas encuentren gente para probar dicha vacuna. En el análisis que estuvimos viendo por la entrevista realizada por el profesor Joao Lemos Estevez al profesor John Yu, pudimos ver que el primer round del duelo televisivo fue caótico, desordenado y lleno de interrupciones, en un debate presidencial bastante hostil. Una de las pocas cosas en las que Donald Trump y Joe Biden estuvieron de acuerdo fue en el conflicto de China. Ambos criticaron al otro por ser demasiado blando en Beijing. Trump ha acusado a Biden de ser engañado por China durante su tiempo como vicepresidente y Biden golpeando a Trump por decir que gran trabajo está haciendo el presidente chino Xi Jinping al comienzo de la pandemia del coronavirus. Pero si bien Beijing prefería no ser un tema en absoluto en las elecciones de Estados Unidos y este raro consenso representa una creciente tensión anti-China en Washington, el debate en su conjunto habrá levantado evidentemente el ánimo en la capital china. En el debate y en ese análisis entre John Yu y el profesor Joao Lemos Estevez, cuando se debatió el tema del debate, se habló también del manejo de la pandemia, la economía, el sistema de salud, los impuestos, el cambio climático, el racismo, la ley y el orden, y también el fraude electoral. Todos esos temas se abordaron muy superficialmente en dicho debate entre Biden y Trump. El candidato presidencial demócrata Joe Biden se negó a decir si presionaría para poner, fin al obstruccionismo o si ampliaría la Corte Suprema si era elegido. Los principales demócratas, incluido el senador Ed Markey y el presidente del Comité Judicial de la Cámara de Representantes, Jerry Nadler, han dicho que el partido debería agregar más escaños a la Corte Suprema si gana suficiente poder en las próximas elecciones del 3 de noviembre. También podríamos analizar que es bastante probable que los demócratas necesiten mantener la Cámara de Representantes, tener una mayoría en el Senado y ganar la presidencia para promulgar el curso. El número de escaños de la Corte Suprema no está establecido en la Constitución, pero se ha mantenido en 9 aproximadamente desde 1869. El obstruccionismo se refiere al umbral de 60 votos que se requiere actualmente en el Senado para terminar un debate sobre alguna legislación propuesta y llevarla también a la votación. También durante la entrevista entre John Yu y el profesor Joao Lemos Estevez, se debatió la elección del presidente Trump con la juez conservadora Amy Coney Barrett como candidata al Tribunal Supremo de Estados Unidos. Donald Trump, recordemos que anunció que nominaría formalmente a la juez Amy Coney Barrett como candidata a ocupar la vacante en el Tribunal Supremo, dejada en este caso por el fallecimiento de la juez progresista Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Lo que, en juicio, abre el proceso de ratificación en el Senado estadounidense, a pocas semanas sobre todo de las elecciones del 3 de noviembre, con lo que ese proceso de ratificación depende ahora del Senado, donde el Partido Republicano sigue contando con la mayoría suficiente para, poder aprobar el nombramiento, a pesar del rechazo manifiesto ya públicamente por senadoras como Susan Collins y Lisa Murkowski, ambas republicanas. Barrett, de 48 años, es una juez federal, nacida en Indiana, de religión católica. Su elección apuntaría durante décadas una clara mayoría conservadora en el Supremo, órgano clave por su capacidad para interpretar leyes y derechos fundamentales, con lo que los miembros del Supremo son cargos vitalicios. La campaña del presidente Donald Trump, desde mi punto de vista, para su reelección ha quedado congelada tras el positivo por COVID-19 del presidente, que podría dejarle fuera de juego durante semanas. En esta tesitura, la campaña tendrá que recaer sobre los hombros de Mike Pence, el futuro vicepresidente. Trump reclutó en 2016 para convencer al voto conservador, pero desde entonces ha sido un actor bastante secundario. Ahora tendrá que arrancarse la camisa y lanzarse a la carretera electoral. Mike Miller, un alto cargo de la campaña de Trump, aseguró ayer en la cadena NBC que Pence acudiría esta semana a Arizona, uno de los estados decisivos, y Nevada, donde tiene previsto enfrentarse a un debate con Kamala Harris, la candidata a vicepresidenta de Joe Biden. El 3 de noviembre de 2020 se van a celebrar estas elecciones presidenciales en Estados Unidos. Los ciudadanos de aquel país pues, deberán elegir entre el actual mandatario Donald Trump y el ex vicepresidente de Barack Obama, Joe Biden. Otro tema importante en ese análisis realizado en este workshop de INISEC, en la gran participación del profesor John Yu de la Universidad de Berkeley y el profesor Joao Lemos Estevez, profesor del área de Ciencias Políticas de INISEC y también profesor de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Lisboa, se concretó también y se analizó, desde mi punto de vista, un tema bastante importante: ¿qué pasa en Estados Unidos si un candidato presidencial abandona la carrera? Nunca un candidato presidencial estadounidense ha fallecido cerca de una elección, pero la hospitalización de Donald Trump por coronavirus ha hecho surgir la pregunta de qué pasará si algo así llegara a ocurrir. Desde mi punto de vista, Trump, hospitalizado con COVID-19, tiene 74 años. En tanto, su oponente demócrata, Joe Biden, de quien se ha informado que goza de una demócrata más viejo en disputar las presidenciales. Una pregunta que deberíamos hacernos: ¿retrasar las elecciones presidenciales? Eso podríamos pensar que es poco probable. El Congreso fija la fecha de la elección y ya fue establecida, como manda la ley norteamericana, para el martes siguiente al primer lunes de noviembre. Tanto el Senado, controlado por los republicanos, como la mayoría demócrata en la Cámara de Representantes tendrían que estar de acuerdo en posponerla. Podemos decir que es poco probable que una mayoría demócrata quisiera posponer la elección. Incluso durante la Guerra Civil en el norte y el sur, durante la Guerra Civil norteamericana, en 1861, la elección de 1864 tuvo lugar como estaba previsto y Abraham Lincoln resuelto el conflicto. Otra pregunta que podríamos hacernos: ¿puede ser reemplazado un candidato? Tanto el Partido Republicano de Trump como el Partido Demócrata de Biden tienen reglas sobre cómo, llenar un eventual vacío en la nominación presidencial. En el caso de los republicanos, los 168 miembros del Comité Nacional Republicano podrían votar para, seleccionar a un reemplazante. También podrían acordar realizar de nuevo su convención de más de 2.500 delegados para seleccionar un nuevo candidato, pero el tiempo probablemente no lo previsible. Una mayoría simple sería lo único necesario para poder elegir a un nuevo candidato en esos escenarios. En el caso de los demócratas, un nuevo candidato presidencial sería seleccionado por casi 450 miembros del Comité Nacional Demócrata. Otra pregunta sería importante a tener en cuenta: ¿puede un candidato sustituto llegar a aparecer en las papeletas? Probablemente no. El problema a este punto es que estamos tan avanzados en las elecciones del 2020 que las papeletas ya están impresas e incluso gente, evidentemente, ya ha votado. Realmente no hay tiempo suficiente para reimprimir papeletas que digan Mike Pence o Kamala Harris. Más de 3,1 millones de estadounidenses ya han votado, según un conteo de la Universidad de Florida, y además las fechas límites para obtener las papeletas varían de estado a estado y en muchos casos ya han pasado. También otra pregunta, y finalmente nos podríamos preguntar ese análisis de qué pasa con el colegio electoral. Aunque en Estados Unidos se realiza una votación popular, el presidente es elegido por una mayoría absoluta. De los 568 miembros del colegio electoral, en todos los estados menos 2, en Nebraska y en Maine, el candidato que gana la mayoría del voto popular allí se lleva todos los electores del estado. Nada en la Constitución obliga a esos electores a votar de una forma u otra, pero la Corte Suprema determinó en julio que los estados podrían multar a electores que les representen en el colegio electoral y que no respeten el voto popular. Los miembros del colegio electoral se reunirán en sus respectivos estados el 14 de diciembre y votarán por el presidente y vicepresidente. En el caso de que un candidato muera o se retire antes de que el colegio electoral realice la votación, las cosas podrían complicarse. Las leyes de cada estado se activarían, pero, en teoría, cada partido a sus electores a votar por un candidato reemplazante. El 6 de enero de 2021, el Congreso debe certificar los resultados y el ganador debe ser investido como presidente el 20 de enero. Con lo cual, este pequeño y breve análisis de la entrevista realizada por INISEC en este workshop, dentro de la actividad del máster de liderazgo político y gestión de crisis del área de ciencias políticas y relaciones internacionales de INISEC, donde hemos entrevistado al profesor John Yu y seguiremos entrevistando a otros perfiles importantes de la política norteamericana y de las universidades para analizar y la evolución también, sobre todo, de cómo va evolucionando la campaña norteamericana a las elecciones presidenciales de Donald Trump con su opositor Joe Biden por el Partido Demócrata. Muchas gracias.